Today I'll be talking about the trivergence of technologies that are going to define the 21st century. As others have defined, we're at the dawn of a new industrial revolution. The first of which was steam in 1784, the second of which was electricity in 1870, the third of which was the computer in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And today we're entering what is called the fourth industrial revolution, defined by cyber systems, artificial intelligence, and the blockchain. Three interrelated concepts, all of which are driving the other corners of the triangle further. They are blockchain and cryptocurrencies, artificial intelligence, mostly today through deep learning, and the big data and the Internet of Things that are collecting the big data to drive artificial intelligence. So quickly, let's go back and take a quick look at the history of computers. In 1941 was the invention of the first semi-modern computer by the Germans to determine the designs of Messerschmitts. In 1943, if you see in the movie The Imitation Game, is that Colossus was developed to crack the German Enigma code. It had absolutely no chance of doing it. A super slow computer, it could look at about 30,000 potential encrypted messages a day, when the possibility in terms of the combinations and permutations that the Enigma machine could generate was in the billions times the billions times the billions. And it was only successful in terms of becoming a major factor in winning World War II is when they realized that all of the messages that the Nazis sent ended with the words Heil Hitler, which made the randomness of the message much less random. In 1948 was the invention of the transistor. And Barden, Bratton, and Shakely won a Nobel Prize in 1948 for inventing the transistor, which the chip, as you can see, is up in the top right-hand corner. Throughout the 60s was the IBM 370, IBM 370 in the 70s, and so on and so on. And today we have got to the density where in 2020, we can build 174 million transistors per cubic millimeter. For those unfamiliar with the metric system, that works out to about 25 billion transistors per square inch. Staggering increase in the density of computers. So how are the blockchain and the Internet of Things interrelated to AI? Clearly, the Internet of Things is going to be gathering data for artificial intelligence. But what may surprise many people is how the blockchain is the enabler that has brought artificial intelligence 10 years earlier. As you know, in the context of the first blockchain, Bitcoin, there are millions and millions of computers managing a distributed ledger based on the concept that a computer can mine for more Bitcoin, and when it does, it creates the next official set of blocks within the blockchain as a whole. And mining originally was done on computers, was done on the main chip within a computer. And what soon happened is people realized for the very simple mathematics of mining for Bitcoin, the graphics card with massive number of parallel chips was much faster at doing that course. Is over the years what has happened with Intel is the chips got more and more complicated, performing sine, cos, and other and much more complex functions. And for data mining, as it turns out, the simplest, smallest RISC chip that can basically only add, divide, subtract, and multiply turns out to be a much, much better chip for mining Bitcoin. And so mining moved from the CPU up to the graphics card. And as it turns out, is that as all of these blocks in the blockchain were being formed, is that the processing moved more and more away from the center of the computer to specialized chips that were designed for mining. And these small specialized chips, ironically, are perfect for artificial intelligence. So what has happened through the blockchain has moved artificial intelligence 10 years forward. So let's go back to the 1950s. Arthur Samuels built a program in 1956 that played a reasonable game of checkers, and although there was no world champion checkers player, by 1962, it was pretty clear that nobody could defeat it. So the age of computers acting semi-intelligently goes back to the 50s and the 60s. So as it advanced, chess, a much more complicated game, by the 1990s, people believed that a computer could beat the world's best chess player, who at the time was Kasparov. So in 1996, IBM built a supercomputer that could calculate 50,000 chess moves a second. And they thought, against that, no human being could possibly have a chance. So in 1996, Deep Blue played against Kasparov, and Kasparov simply crushed it. IBM was stunned. So the following year, they put more of their best programmers and more of the best chess minds in the world together to create a massive new computer system program that could calculate 200,000 moves a second. And they put it up against Kasparov once again. And Kasparov changed his strategy and crushed Deep Blue in the first game. And so the programmers went back and, given Kasparov's change of strategy, rewrote a whole bunch of code. And what do you know, when it was over, it was 3.5 games for Deep Blue and 2.5 games for Kasparov. And Deep Blue went on to work for United Airlines to ensure that every seat on every plane, through dynamic pricing, was packed. Okay, so to put it in perspective, is that 2 years ago, Google took DeepMind, a neural network-based artificial intelligence engine, and instead of supplying it with all the wisdom of all those experts, or just simply introducing it to the game, what happened is that when it played against the most advanced chess program in the world, they turned it off when neural networks could beat it 100 games to 0. So computers are getting much more intelligent than they used to be. So as an example, I have 2 daughters, one of which happens to be American and one of which happens to be Canadian. I'll let you guess who is who. But I had a rule when these kids were growing up. If I was in my study working, they could not interrupt me under any circumstance, if I was working or on a conference call, with one exception. And that one exception was math homework. And if my kids had math homework, I'd shut down every conference call, I'd turn off the computer, and I would tell them that the most fun in the world was actually doing math homework, hoping and aspiring that I would be able to turn them into mathematicians. Well, it didn't work out. The one on the left is going to end up being a public school teacher, and the one on the right is a geologist with aspirations of being in investment banking, a place in which I personally spent 20 years. So the point I'm trying to make here is that humans giving information to other humans, teaching them, can be a 20-year process that fails. In artificial intelligence and with computers, what happens is that one computer can learn perfectly from a previous generation of computer in a millisecond. So that gives them, in the long view, an incredible advantage in terms of who ultimately is going to be more intelligent. Okay, let's take a look at what's happened in the context of cryptocurrency over the last period. And if you can see this chart, what it basically says is that when the pandemic hit, is that the price of cryptocurrencies went down dramatically. I assume that's because people needed cash to cover the shortages they had, the shorts that they'd already had in the marketplace. So, but since then, as you can see, cryptocurrencies have gone up dramatically. Ethereum, which is an incredibly slow cryptocurrency that basically is only useful for speculation, is up over 100%. Bitcoin is up about 45%. And Cosmos, which is very different than the other 2 technologies, and that is it has finality in terms of transactions that are submitted to it, is up about 75%. And what I mean by slow is, theoretically, if you developed an ATM network on Ethereum, you'd have to wait 3 to 5 minutes to be 100% sure the transaction actually made it to the immutable ledger. With Bitcoin, it could well be an hour. So these currencies, which are the most valued cryptocurrencies, are good for speculation. But other than that, in terms of actual financial use, they're very difficult because of their slow speed. So if I can go back again to my days at Citibank, is that I got a phone call from New York, and there was a meeting in New York because the chairman, Walter Wriston, in 1982, said, effective immediately, we're no longer a bank, we're an information processing company. And to prove the point, he gave us a satellite over the Atlantic with a transponder to which to create new applications. So we went to the meeting and said, okay, great, we've got the technology, what's the business problem? And so the first thing we did, which was fairly obvious, is that IBM stock is traded in the New York Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange, and it was trivial to set up an application, depending on the rates between the currencies and what the prices were in the two marketplaces, to arbitrage the opportunity and to make money. So the second thing we thought of is giving real-time funds transfer capability to large financial institutions. So without talking to the business people, we went out, we built this huge application, and I remember the first meeting we had in Paris to present it to an actual CFO of a country CFO of an American car company. And when we did and showed him how that if the company worldwide was long in pounds in Milan and short in pounds in Paris, they could do a real-time transfer internally within the organization without talking to Citicorp or our foreign exchange desk and the fees and the rates associated with it. And we felt that overall, what would happen is we'd lose in the foreign exchange business, but that these large car companies would immediately put all their funds into Citicorp to get this kind of visibility. So at the end of the presentation, we were all so proud in terms of what we did, and we asked for his reaction. And what he said is if we implemented the system and it went live, he would move every dime he had out of Citicorp. And we sat there in just shock and disbelief. And he went to explain once a quarter he flew to Detroit, and he had a chance to look at, understand, and massage the numbers before he presented them. And the idea that Detroit would have real-time access to his information, to him was an absolute horror. The point of the matter, in the context of blockchain, is what has happened is many people have started with the technology and said to themselves, what's the business problem? And when you do that, you will often miss the mark. So in some ways, we're in the winter of discontent in terms of the implementation of blockchain solutions. So let's do a quick wrap of what's happening in the context of technology lately. In the last year, both Intel and IBM stock are down, and TSM, AMD, and NVIDIA are way up. And the reason for that is these startup companies, but a few years ago, their stocks have exploded because AMD chips today are much faster and cheaper than Intel chips. But where the revolution has truly occurred is in the context of NVIDIA. Once focused on producing high-end graphics and gaming, they moved into blockchain mining and abandoned that about a year ago and have focused since on artificial intelligence. And the speed that they deliver through this new architecture is staggering. To put the recent revolution in terms of the speed of computer chips in perspective, is a high-end A9 Intel chip will run at about 1 teraflop. And in England today, in Cambridge, they're building to do, among other things, help find the next vaccine with AstraZeneca, is a supercomputer that runs at 400 petaflops. And to put that into perspective, the A9 chip is about 1 teraflop, and this supercomputer in Cambridge will be 400,000 times faster. And not to be upshot by the British, the Italians are now working on a supercomputer based on NVIDIA chips that will be 25 times faster than this. The old Moore's law that the speed of a computer, in essence, doubles every 18 months is now over. computers are increasing in their throughput and their speed through new architectures orders of magnitude a year. And that is bringing artificial intelligence to the mainstream much faster than anyone ever anticipated. So the other revolution that's occurring in technology has to do with solid-state disk. So if you look at this particular chart, you will see that if we do an analogy and a CPU cycle takes 1 second, you'll see that memory is slower. Computer chips run in the gigahertz, memory is in the megahertz. So what it means is that the input in and out of the chip cannot possibly be as fast as the chip is. But the revolution that's happened in the last decade is we've moved from rotational disk, physical speeds, to solid-state disk, which is at electronic speeds. So what used to take, relatively speaking, 6 months in terms of getting information into the chip is now taking 3 days. So we have, on the one hand, we have an order of magnitude increase in a very short period of time in terms of the processing and the ability to get information into the computer 50 times faster. So if you take a look at, for instance, the Gartner's hype cycle, it says that blockchain is ahead of artificial intelligence, both moving into the trough of disillusionment. And I fundamentally disagree. I think artificial intelligence is not only in the slope of enlightenment, it's going to have dramatic and productive and constructive input in terms of applications in a very short period of time. The transformation is going to be revolutionary. And then, God help us when quantum computing, which could be many, many orders of magnitude even faster, comes online. So the days of being limited by the speed of the computer and by how quickly you can get information in and out of the computer is over. We have a perfect storm in terms of the trivergence of those 3 different technologies. So let's look at traditional approaches to artificial intelligence. And these approaches have been tried, most of which have failed over the last 50 years. Symbolic reasoning, let's talk expert systems, let's talk knowledge management. It was tried 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and fundamentally it was a failure. If I could jump down to evolutionary algorithms, the concept of creating traditional code, and then based on experience, constantly improving it until the system gets more intelligence. Bayesian inference there is fundamentally statistics. And there's a new generation of systems that come online that actually can touch, can see, and can feel. But for the next period, I'd like to focus on models based on the human brain, on neurons, on connections. So neural networks. Depending on your age, you may look in the sky and say, is it a bird? Is it a plane? Is it Superman? If you're younger, you might say, is it a bird? Is it a plane? Is it a drone? So basically what happens in your brain and in the neural networks and artificial intelligent deep learning engines today is you make an initial assumption. And then based on other information, such as the speed at which it's traveling, the distance away it is, the colors, is you will go to a next layer of neural networks. And then ultimately you will come to a conclusion. From OpenAI, a company set up by Elon Musk, GPT-3 has just come online. And to give an indication of how quickly this is evolving is that GPT-2 had 1.5 billion neurons in effect. And the new version is up to 175 billion. So dramatic increases in throughput and power and intelligence in these systems. So if I can just give you a short demonstration of how smart robots are becoming today. From Boston Dynamics. And this robot is doing things that I can tell you personally, I can't. And the speed at which they will improve will be dramatic. So today, robots are now making the next generation of robots, which will make even further another generation of robots. The world is going to change very, very quickly. Not surprisingly, the Japanese have always been fascinated with robots, and in terms of developing robots, the vast majority of the effort is occurring in the Far East. North America is far behind. In terms of consumer artificial intelligence, be it Siri, Alexa, or Cortana, they have not caught up with Google Assistant. And this is a firm that tests how smart they are every year. And to some degree, they cheat because they make the tests more difficult every year. But even then, in terms of all four systems, the improvements in the last year have been dramatic. So self-driving cars, wonderful aspiration. Your car can be out making money while you're sleeping. You can turn your garage into a studio. Great feeling. It's going to be a wonderful thing. Now, if you take a closer look, Uber is losing like $1 billion a quarter. And if you take a close look at their business model, it's not to transform your car into a money-making machine. It's to get rid of their drivers and for the company ultimately to be profitable. So the idea that your car is making money while you're sleeping, I just don't think is going to happen. Now, if you take a look at how successful they are, in the last 2 years, Google's Waymo has gone from the ability to drive 5,000 miles without human intervention to 11,000 miles, which is a difficult number to deal with, is because if you have to pay attention for something that may happen every 11,000 miles, the probability of you being attentive at that particular juncture is difficult. So it's problematic. In terms of Uber, the number that they publish is very old, and the fact they're not publishing new numbers, I think, says something. Chevrolet originally announced that it was going to have a self-driving car in 2019. So it clearly is a little more difficult than people originally made it out to be. Zhu Ri works for the equivalent of Amazon in China. He works for JD.com. And he works in a plant that, like an Amazon warehouse, it ships 200,000 packages a day, and it's about the size of 8 football fields. And when the Washington Post interviewed him 2 years ago, they asked what he thought of his job, and he said he loved it. And they said, there must be some downside. What do you not like about this job? Is there anything that you find disconcerting? And he said he found the job incredibly lonely. And when they asked him what he meant by that, as it turns out, this is a completely automated warehouse, and there are 6 engineers repairing equipment in the warehouse, but it's fundamentally run without people. When I was speaking in Kerala in India last year, they showed me an example of a 3D printer that, if you look below it, printed, among other things, a 3D printer. So the idea of robots making new robots, printers making new printers, is we're heading into a completely new paradigm in terms of how things are made. So this one I thought was interesting when I read an article on the idea that maybe computers can be more objective than people, is that they can not take into consideration the looks of the lawyers or how articulate or how convincing the lawyers may sound, that the computers would fundamentally stick to the facts. And originally I was enthralled by this argument until I thought of the concept of computers sentencing people to death. And when I thought about that for a few minutes, I said, maybe that's not the best idea. A long time ago, I was the chief designer and architect for the system that supplies the information that's used by both Boeing and Airbus to direct their aircraft. It supplies the flight information for them. And back then, this was 20 years ago, we speculated on the day that planes would not have pilots. And we came to the conclusion that the only way it was possible is we'd have one pilot in the front to calm the passengers and a Doberman pinscher in the cockpit to make sure the pilot didn't touch anything. But back then, it was impossible because air traffic instructions were analog. They were voice-based. And so a year and a half ago, the FAA started to transmit instructions to the aircraft. So the ability to have a completely drone airplane is now a reality. And I suspect what's going to happen is we will get comfortable flying to the airport in a drone without a human pilot, and ultimately we will get very comfortable with the concept of aircraft without pilots. So what will computers soon do better? And there are many articles on what that may be. But I think, to me, the real question is, what will computers not do better? And as I've said from the beginning, is that artificial intelligence runs on big data. And as it turns out, he who has the most data, or she who has the most data, will win. Because if you have more data, you come up with smarter artificial intelligence engines, which gets you more customers, that gives you more data to come up with even smarter artificial intelligence engines. So Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, these companies are going to predominate in this space. But surely creative jobs are safe. Computers can't be creative. I think that's something that we all clearly know. So let's take a look. Take a look at novels. But computers have analyzed them and basically said there are 6 different plots to novels. There's Romeo and Juliet, which at the beginning is romantic and it goes straight downhill ever since. There's Cinderella, in which things get better and better and better, and then suddenly things head in the opposite direction. So computers are now analyzing novels and attempting to write novels themselves. You tell a computer, would you like to combine a couple of concepts? Van Gogh, fish, and snails. And what do you know? It comes up with an interesting but somewhat unusual picture. Or just 2 simple concepts, dogs and spaghetti. And what do you know? An artificial intelligence engine can come up with a reasonably good-looking picture, if indeed that is what you want to look at. Obvious, artificial intelligence engine was fed pictures from 10 different French artists, and as it turns out, the picture that it came up with, which is a combination of the styles of all those artists, actually sold for 100,000 euros. So the rise of populism requires much reflection in terms of why this is happening today. And in my mind, the reason for it is that compensation and productivity have been disconnected, is that people less and less are participating in the value they're creating. And if you take a look at the statistics, basically from 1980, productivity is going up 6 times faster than wages. And it's putting a huge stress on society in the context of how it should function. And I think it's having huge political implications. Is that in this pandemic, for instance, it's believed that 25% of New Yorkers will not be able to survive without food support this winter. And you compare that to how the billionaires are getting richer and richer, and it puts a stress on society, the conclusion of which I think is difficult to discern. So who will it affect? Obviously, you're working in a warehouse, you're a truck driver, waiters. There are a lot of jobs today that will be soon made redundant. For example, a number from McKinsey is 800 million people will lose their jobs this decade as a result of artificial intelligence. So the World Economic Forum took a look at this in 2018, and not surprisingly, there's many redundant roles, from the warehouse operator to the truck driver, even the waitress per se. And there will be new roles, and the new roles are artificial intelligence programming, data management, data marketing, digital marketing, and many things. And the big question for society is, can you take a truck driver and turn them into a Python programmer? And I'm sure with some you can, but I fear with the majority of them, you can't. So let's just take a look at some of the numbers here. Is that interest rates are plummeting. If you take a look at the chart in the top right-hand corner, you'll see for Germany and some other countries in Europe, they're actually negative interest rates. You go to the bank, you borrow $1 million euros, and a year later, you owe them 995,000 euros. And I suppose if you're in the real estate business, that's very attractive. But to me, what is fascinating is that as I saw the rise of investment banking working for banks, is that Black-Scholes and options and derivatives were created on the formula in the bottom right, which is near to the heart and soul of every investment banker. The thing that's interesting about it, the L in it is a natural logarithm. And if interest rates are negative, it doesn't work. There is no such thing as a ln of a negative number. So even the mathematics behind Wall Street is being challenged by what's happening with the virus and in the world today. In the field of neuroscience, it is believed that computers will understand how our brains actually work in such a way that we can't understand how they actually work. So in many disciplines, artificial intelligence is going to become smarter than we are. That if you take a look at the billion genes that we have in each of us, is for a supercomputer to take 10,000 people and see what correlations exist is relatively simple. For the human mind, it's simply unimaginable. So what can we do about the rise of the machines? Okay, one possibility is we just accept they're the next phase of evolution, which is something I'm not particularly fond of doing. What some people do are Luddites. They're attacking them. Is that in Arizona, where they're testing self-driving cars, people are throwing rocks at them, they're smashing them, they're trying to fight back against the rise of the machine. One idea that has been articulated by a few leading thinkers is maybe what we should do is tax them. If there are going to be fewer people working and there are going to be more robots working, maybe we should tax them to pay for schools, healthcare, and for other costs. What it is also doing is it's turning some economic thinking on its head. Is that Milton Friedman, a long time ago, came up with the concept of helicopter money. That if the economy got in bad enough trouble, what you should do is just load money into helicopters, fly them around, and dump them on society as a whole. And so if you take a look at three sort of like major thinkers in the context of economic theory, Friedman argued that if you put equality above freedom, you would end up with neither. But if you put freedom above equality, you would end up with a great deal of both. And I think for a period that may have been true, but since the 1980s, there's been a divergence between what the average individual is making and what the super rich are making. John Maynard Keynes, who's the father of deficit finance, had a different perspective. He thought that capitalism was the idea that the most wickedest of men doing the most wickedest of things was for the greater benefit of all. And Pavlina Tcherneva, who is the mother of MMT, modern monetary theory, which is supported by AOC, basically say deficits don't matter. To be more specific, believes that the government can finance massive healthcare initiatives, educational and other initiatives, and keep printing money. And if you run a large deficit, you've got to look at it in the perspective that means private society is running a huge surplus, and that you can keep printing money indefinitely until inflation becomes a problem. And to me, what is ironic and funny about reading Bloomberg and other economic papers is 12 months ago, MMT was considered a fringe theory. And for the last year, the last 6 months at least, what every government in the world has been doing is printing money consistent with MMT like it's going out of style. And ironically, the economists in the world today, with all that extra money, are still more concerned about deflation than they are inflation. So have we been concerned about the rise of technology before? Keynes felt that by now, everyone would be working 10 to 15 hours a week maximum, And all of us would be defined by our hobbies, as the concept of what I do for a living would be about your hobbies. It would not be about your work. Kennedy, during his period, a large number of Nobel laureates were so concerned about what computers could do in terms of displacing jobs that they set up a group called the Triple Revolution. Well, as it turns out, in the last 50 or 60 years, computers have created far more jobs than they've destroyed. But this time, are the concerns real? Is it actually going to happen? Now, if you take a look at principle statements that are coming out of all the major players in terms of artificial intelligence, they all sound wonderful. But in reality, how a neural network works, it's not hard-coded, it's based on the data. And if the historical data has been racist or sexist, the conclusion that the AI engine will make will be racist and sexist. So the very nature of neural networks is there's no code, there is no transparency. And if the historical data is unfair, they will be unfair. And in the concept of inclusiveness, if he or she who has the most data wins, it may not be the most inclusive society that we're looking for. In terms of privacy and security, the more data, the less that these engines have, the less privacy and security we have. Now, there's a concept in terms of federated artificial intelligence that basically says let an artificial intelligence engine inside, say, the healthcare company to have access to the data, create inputs to the next artificial intelligence engine in such a way that our anonymity is protected, but there are simply huge challenges to ensure that this evolving technology is going to be fair. The General Counsel of NASA, Glenn Gerstle, I think summed it up quite well. He said, the unprecedented scale and pace of technological change is going to outstrip our ability to effectively adapt it. And it may have a major effect on legitimacy and the stability of government and societal structures. But we are entering a period in which computers will be able to sing Tommy by The Who. They will be able to see us through LiDAR and radar. They will be able to hear us through automatic speech recognition, through tactile, touch-sensitive fabric. They'll be able to feel us touch them. And an artificial intelligence engine, unlike a doctor, 5 minutes into a program, can read the latest paper on the coronavirus that was published 2 minutes into your appointment. So in the context of healing, artificial intelligence engines may have huge advantages over human beings. So, is the Terminator inevitable? The Terminator is out there. It feels no pity, remorse, or pain, and it will not stop until we are all dead. Is that the future of what the world is going to look like? And I think the probability of that is very low. Malicious they will not be, but will they make mistakes? Will they make crazy mistakes? And the answer to that is simple. One example that has been hypothesized is the paperclip conundrum. And what happens is you ask your office robot to collaborate with your car robot and other robots to get you more paper clips. And so what happens is it goes to Office Depot and it gets all the paper clips, and with no further instructions, before you know what happens, it's collaborating with the tow truck robots and the smelter robot and is melting down cars to make you more paper clips. So the whole nature of instructions to artificial intelligence are not as precise as they were in the old days of if-then-else statements. So there is no doubt that we're going to have some bizarre occurrences in the next future, but in terms of actually trying to kill us, the probability of computers trying to do this, I believe, is quite low. In summary, today, new blockchain, proof-of-work mining-inspired architectures are enabling disruptive advancements in deep learning and robotics that are now finally consuming, digesting, and learning from the massive backlog of big data, resulting in the trivergence of artificial intelligence, the blockchain, and the Internet of Smart Things. Clearly here, the synergies of the whole are far greater than their parts. Companies with leaders that understand them individually and their power collectively will succeed, and those that do not will tend to decline and ultimately may disappear. The stakes are high. While this is a time of great danger, the Trivergence also creates a period of unprecedented opportunity to create organizations that are faster, smarter, and leaner, that will become the engines of value creation for the 21st century. Does your company fully understand the perils and opportunities this Trivergence creates? Thank you very much.